Rabbi Lord Sachs, we're so honored that you and Lady Elaine Sachs could join us here tonight. Can you all hear me? And for those of you who don't know, he is...
This might work better.
Rabbi Lord Sachs, this sounds better to me, is a global religious leader, a philosopher, author of more than 25 books, and a moral voice for our time. And just sitting at the table listening to him talk has been an amazing, wonderful experience. And until September 2013, he served as the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth, a position he held for 22 years. He's been described by the Prince of Wales as a light unto this nation, and by former Prime Minister Tony Blair as an intellectual giant. And he's a visiting professor at many universities in Britain, the United States, and Israel. And right now he is the Ingeborg and Ira Rennert Global's Distinguished Professor of Judaic Thought at NYU, and the Kressel and Efron Family University Professor of Jewish Thought at Yeshiva University. He holds 16 honorary degrees, author of 25 books, and the book that we all heard about today, The Great Partnership of God, Science, and the Search for Meaning. And he's a frequent contributor to radio, television, and the press in Britain and around the world. We're honored to bestow upon him our 2015 Moment Magazine Creativity Award. We started these awards in 2010 to celebrate distinguished individuals for exceptional creativity in their profession and their work on behalf of humankind. We've given them to musician Theodore Bickel, Leon Fleischer, violinist Joshua Bell, Robert Pinsky, actually Rebecca Goldstein, who's a philosopher, Steven Pinker, David Brooks, and you're the first non-American recipient, and also the first rabbi, and you're certainly the first Lord. So it's my great pleasure to present this to you, Rabbi Lord Sachs, if you'd like to join us up here, in recognition for your groundbreaking explorations into the complexity of the relationship between science and religion. And so he's going to speak to us for a few minutes about a variety of topics, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards, and in this Q&A we'll raise our hands and ask questions. Bye. Thank you.
We can put it on your laptop. Okay.
Nadine, Ronit, wonderfully distinguished fellow panelists, Michael Krasny, Nancy Abrams, and Joel Primack, John Efron, Marcus Feldman. Thank you so much to the JCC for hosting us. What an incredible JCC this is. We don't have anything like it in Britain. Thank you, Nadine, for thinking of this wonderful, wonderful concept. And to be awarded this award by Moment Magazine, which has been a real creative force in American Jewish life and sent its ripples way beyond America, because I always used to read it, and I still do. I feel a little like the late Abba Eban, you remember, who was Foreign Secretary in Israel and who was educated at Cambridge, the English Cambridge, that is, and the lower class one, you know that one. And he returned to his alma mater and began his speech with the sentence that it is here that I learnt the integrity, honesty, and love of truth that has been such a disadvantage to me in my political career. I feel a little bit like that, because for an Orthodox rabbi to be commended on creativity is a somewhat ambivalent compliment, because in Orthodoxy, if it's true, it isn't new, and if it's new, it isn't true. But I thank you so much, and will cherish this award. Nadine actually asked me to say a few words, about my least favorite subject, which is European anti-Semitism. I'm sorry about this. You're getting it in all directions, I'm afraid. I'm not quite sure, but since you want to know about it, I'm going to tell you about it. anti-Semitism is the least creative thing you can think of and the most destructive. But in a sense, anti-Semitism survives because of a weird and dangerous kind of creativity. Let me explain why. It seems to me that if you actually ask what is anti-Semitism, what do anti-Semites believe, you will see immediately that the answer is a series of contradictions. Jews were hated in the 19th century because they were rich and because they were poor, because they were capitalists and because they were communists, because they kept to themselves and because they infiltrated everywhere. Voltaire hated Jews because of their superstitious faith. Stalin hated Jews because they were rootless cosmopolitans who believed nothing. So anti-Semitism is a stira mineube. It is a series of internal contradictions, and it can only be understood on the model of epidemiology. Anti-Semitism is a virus that infects the body politic. Now, the body has the most remarkable, sophisticated system for detecting and defeating viruses that one can imagine, the human immune system. And of course, the way viruses survive, I assume that applies to computer viruses, I really wouldn't know, is by mutating. And anti-Semitism is a virus that, by my calculation, has mutated 3 times in the course of 2,000 years, and we are living through the 4th mutation. So the return of anti-Semitism to Europe within living memory of the Holocaust is an extraordinary fact, because after the Holocaust, Europe made the most determined attempt that any civilization has ever made to create an immune system that would guarantee never again. So anti-Semitism has returned despite 50 years at least of anti-racist legislation, 50 years and more than 50 years of interfaith dialogue, 50 years of Holocaust education, and yet it is returned by mutating. And let me therefore explain to you what makes the new anti-Semitism different from its predecessors. 3 things. Number 1, in the Middle Ages, Jews were hated for their religion. In the 19th and early 20th century, they were hated for their race. Today, they are hated for their nation state. And that is radically new, and that is what makes anti-Zionism, not criticism of Israel. I mean, for heaven's sake, I don't know any Israeli who doesn't criticize Israel. So that doesn't, criticizing Israel does not make you an anti-Semite, but anti-Zionism, the idea that Israel alone, I mean, there are 102 countries of the United Nations in which a majority of the population is Christian. There are 56 members of the League of Muslim States. That Jews should have one country of their own is one too many. That is the new mode of anti-Semitism. Second, believe it or not, it is very difficult to justify hate in public discourse. We have a moral sense, and therefore it's quite difficult. Therefore, throughout history, anti-Semites have always been forced to turn to the single most prestigious source of authority in a culture at a given time. In the Middle Ages, clearly, the most prestigious source of authority was religion, and therefore anti-Semitism was religious anti-Judaism. In 19th century, post-Enlightenment scientific Europe, religion was no longer the most pristine source of authority. Instead, what was the most authoritative was science. And so anti-Semitism was justified on the basis of two disciplines that were thought of as sciences in their time, although they are absurdly not so in retrospect, the so-called scientific study of race, a mix of anthropology and biology, and number two, social Darwinism, Spencer in England, but Haeckel in Germany, that the same law that applies in biology applies in society, that the strong survive by eliminating the weak. After Hiroshima, science was no longer the most pristine source of authority. Indeed, after the Holocaust, the highest source of authority has been human rights. And that is why in the somewhat notorious conference against racism in Durban in August 2001, 1 week before 9/11, Israel was accused, certainly among the parallel NGO conference, of the 5 cardinal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and attempted genocide. An assault on Jews in Israel must be couched today in terms of human rights. The third difference is that the carriers of anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages were the churches. In the 19th century, there were national cultures. So it made sense to ask, is France in 1880, after Edward Drumon's La France Juive, or Germany or Austria, are they anti-Semitic countries? Because the carrier was national culture. Today, it is not a national culture. Today, the carrier of anti-Semitism is the internet, and that can target very small minority groups who can perpetrate, God forbid, the most tremendous suicide bombings as we had. Well, you understand. So, there's no connection between the degree of anti-Semitism in a country and its spread in an overall population. In all the recent surveys, Britain emerges as a less anti-Semitic country than the United States. The least anti-Semitic country in Europe is Denmark, but these are countries with vehement anti-Israel biases. But these are spread by elites, but especially by the internet, in which the radical Islamists are the most expert. So this is what is a little bit shocking about the return of anti-Semitism to Europe within living memory of the Holocaust. And is it serious? Look, I hate talking about this, I really do, but it's serious enough that 8 years ago, in May 2007, I had the opportunity to address together the 3 heads of Europe. Angela Merkel, who is chairing the European Commission, the head of the EU, Jose Manuel Barroso, and Hans-Gert Pöttering, the head of the European Parliament in Strasbourg. And I said to them, Jews in Europe go back a long way. We have a lot of history between us. The experience of Jews in Europe added certain words to the vocabulary of humankind. Words like expulsion, public disputation, forced conversion, inquisition, auto-da-fe, ghetto, and pogrom, without even mentioning the H word. I said, that is past, and we live with that past. But as for the future, the Jews of Europe are asking, is there a future for the Jews in Europe? And that should concern you, the leaders of Europe. That was 8 years ago, and things have got worse since. So the situation is this, that the political leadership of Europe know there is a problem, but they do not have a solution. That is what is worrying. It's not lack of will, it's lack of knowledge of how to cope with this new and very different mutation. Now, you've just given me a very lovely award on creativity. So can I just therefore end by saying, what would it be to respond creatively to this challenge? I mean, the really bad way of responding is to allow ourselves to be dismayed by this, because that's what our enemies want. And Baruch Hashem, thank the Almighty, we're pretty predictable guys, you know. So, you know, Jews get together, what do? They say, you know what? The world hates us. And that makes us feel quite good about ourselves. But I mean, the truth is that is not a creative response to the problem. So let me suggest, therefore, 3 creative responses. Number 1, in April 2002, when all this was beginning, I called in the Union of Jewish Students, the leadership of the Union of Jewish Students. This was after the suicide bombing in the Park Hotel in Netanya, as they were sitting down to begin the Seder service. You remember in 2002, Israel then went in, and there was this terrible libel, really, about Jenin, where there was supposed to be a massacre of 5,000, then it was 500, and in the end, 52 Palestinians, 23 Israelis died. But I called them in and I said, the months and years ahead are going to be difficult. And I want you to know that we are going to be alongside you. We stayed very close to our Jewish students. We didn't leave them to fight the battle alone. I went out there into the campuses. Whenever there was a bad scene, I would go and speak to what we call university vice chancellors, what you call university presidents. We had pretty zero tolerance for this kind of stuff. But I said to them, these are going to be times of anti-Semitism. I want you to do the unexpected thing. I want you to lead the campaign against Islamophobia. I think in psychotherapy they'd call that paradoxical intervention. It's the least expected thing. And fascinatingly, they ran with it, and out of it emerged an organization called the Coexistence Trust, Jews and Muslims fighting anti-Semitism and Islamophobia together. And it began at that meeting of university students. That was a little little fragment of hope done by doing the unexpected thing. The second thing is, and I began to say this already in the EU, in the headquarters in Brussels in 2003, we have to understand Jews cannot fight anti-Semitism alone. The victim cannot cure the crime. The hated cannot cure the hate. So I said in Brussels, I will lead the fight for Christians anywhere in the world to live their faith without fear, and I've really done that. But I need you Christians to lead the fight for my people to live their faith without fear. We will lead the fight against Islamophobia, but I need you Muslims to lead the fight against Judeophobia. And in order to do this, we have to reframe anti-Semitism. We make a terrible mistake if we think anti-Semitism is only about Jews. It just isn't. Why anti-Semitism? We read in the book of Esther on Purim from one of the world's earliest anti-Semites, the statement of Haman, Yeshno am echad mefuzam forad benu amim. There is this people scattered and distributed among all the peoples, v'datehem shonot mikolam. And their laws are different from anyone else. Jews were hated because they were different. They were the paradigm case of dislike of the unlike. You will say that everyone is different, and that's true. But Jews were the only people consistently throughout history to insist on the right to be different, the dignity of difference. They were the only minority consistently, not always, but for the most part, to refuse to assimilate to the dominant culture or convert to the dominant faith. They were the most conspicuous non-Christian population in a Christian Europe, just as today they're most conspicuous non-Muslim presence in a Muslim Middle East. Jews were hated because they were different. but difference is what makes us human. It is the fact that each one of us, even genetically identical twins, are different, that makes each one of us irreplaceable and unsubstitutable. It is our difference that makes every human life, ka'olam malay, like a universe. And it is the difference in every culture that makes every culture unique, special, and non-negotiably have a right to exist. Every single human being is holy, and every culture is special because it's different. So a country that has culture that has no room for Jews has no room for difference. It therefore has no room for humanity. So anti-Semitism is a hatred that begins with Jews but never ends with Jews. And that is why we have to stand together with as many friends and allies as we can, with Christians, with moderate Muslims, with Sikhs, with Hindus. Hindus feel at least as threatened as we do. Sikhs are wonderful. They feel the Jews of India. They're caught between the Muslims and the Christians, so they say, you know what? We must be Jewish. They're terrific. And they wear bigger yarmulkes than us, but they're really good. And it is Christians who are the primary victims right now. In the Middle East, there's the religious equivalent of ethnic cleansing of Christians taking place in one country after another. I'm not going to bore you with all the facts. And as for Muslims, 90% of the victims of Islamists today are Muslims. So let us find that common ground and reframe anti-Semitism and see it for what it is, a crime against humanity because of an inability to make space for difference. And thirdly, the third creative thing we must do is to accept that anti-Semitism happens to Jews, but never to allow it to define what it is to be a Jew. There was a bad moment in modern Jewish history when after 67, a very, very fine Jewish theologian, the late Emil Fackenheim, formulated something which he probably didn't take all that seriously, but became the leitmotif of a generation, that a 614th command has been added to the Torah, thou shalt not hand Hitler a posthumous victory. I mean, never was more negative definition given of a people's raison d'etre. Do not internalize anti-Semitism. It happens to Jews, but it's not who we are. And with it, let me therefore tell you the following story that I find highly significant. Under Mikhail Gorbachev in the late 80s, as there was glasnost and perestroika in Russia, Jews were freer to be Jews. The trouble is that anti-Semites were freer to be anti-Semitic. And one of our rabbis, a very Haredi rabbi, went out from Manchester. Manchester is the nearest you get to heaven, short of Bnei Brak and Williamsburg. It's a different country altogether. And he went out, with a long kapota and a long beard and a big black hat. He went out to help the rebirth of Jewish life in Russia. After he'd been there a few months, a young Russian late Jewish woman came to see him in great distress. She said, I'd been growing up in Russia. I never spoke about my Jewishness. Nobody ever spoke about it. But now when I walk in the street, they shout, Jew, Jew, what shall I do? And the rabbi looked at her and he said, you know what, given the way I'm dressed, probably they don't think I'm an Episcopalian. He said, but I've been here for several months and nobody's shouted Jew, Jew at me. Why do you think that is? And she thought for a moment, and she said the following, because they know if they shout Jew at me, I will treat that as an insult. But if they shout Jew at you, they know you will treat that as a compliment. One way of fighting anti-Semitism is to walk tall as Jews and never, ever internalize the little anti-Semite in here. So let me end, therefore, on a note of hope. There was, in my Bubba and Zeta's time, a part of the East End of London, like the Lower East Side in New York, which was almost entirely Jewish. It was called Spitalfields. There was a road there, Brick Lane. There was a Shul Machzikei. This was the epicenter of Eastern European Jewry as it arrived first generation in England. Today, that is completely Muslim. The Machzikei Shul, of which Rav Kook was the rabbi during the First World War, is today a mosque. And it's completely Muslim. There was a little building, 19 Princelet Street, which was once a Huguenot chapel, then became a shul for East European Jews. And a Jewish couple, it's been derelict for many years, turned it into a museum of immigration. And it is absolutely wonderful. These 5, 6, 7-year-old Muslim children can go in and see the experience of the Jews and the Irish as they arrived in England, and they identify completely with this. And it's an absolutely wonderful education for these Muslim kids to realize we have this in common with the Jews. And I actually saw these 6 and 7-year-old Muslim children, they're all from Bangladesh, they're a particular ethnic group. I actually saw them perform a little Jewish story. It was just unbelievable, and I had never heard this story before. Michael, I give it to you because it can go in your book of Jewish anecdotes, because it's a great anecdote. So I just remind you that I first heard this story from 6 and 7-year-old Muslim children from Bangladesh. And this is the story they told. There was once a very, very anti-Semitic village in Russia. And it was so anti-Semitic that no Jew ever ventured into this place, except one day a Jewish trader with a horse and cart and selling goods decides he's going to go to this town and, settle down there, sell some things, establish a business. He comes into town. The townspeople are shocked. A Jew dares to come in this town. And they surround his horse and cart, shouting, "Jew! Jew!" And to their amazement, an enormous smile appears on his face. And he says, "Thank you so much for this beautiful welcome. Nobody has ever welcomed me so warmly before." And he gets out his little money bag, and he takes out a 5 ruble coin, and gives it to each of these people. "Thank you for making me feel so welcome." Well, they don't know what to make of this, but 5 rubles is 5 rubles. So they go away, they take the money, they go away. The next day they are intrigued. What kind of person is this? Let's go and see. So they surround the house that he's decided to live in. And again they're shouting, "Jew, Jew!" And again he comes out with a big smile on his face. And again he takes out his money belt. And he says, "Well, I don't have so much money today, but please accept 1 gold ruble for each of you for making me feel so at home." Well, again, they don't know what to make, but a ruble is a ruble. They come around the 3rd time, the next day, and they surround his house and they're shouting, "Jew, Jew!" again. And he comes out again with a smile on his face, and he takes out his money bag and he says, "Unfortunately, I have not very much money left, so today I can only give you 10 kopecks each." And they look at him shocked and they say, "You think for a lousy 10 kopecks we're going to shout 'Jew, Jew' at you?" And they never shouted "Jew" again. Thank you very much indeed.
We're actually going to first of all, thank you so much. That was so wonderful and very important for us to hear. We do want to have some questions, and I actually want to start with the question that we had discussed at our table, which was a little bit about the inside story about the academic boycott by British academicians against Israel. And so why don't you just tell us a little bit about what really happened?
Yeah, look, here is the fact, and it's quite important for you to understand it. Some of our worst enemies, and they tend to be radical Islamists, are very, very clever at understanding how easy it is to make Jews feel afraid. There's a social historian, Kenena Hara, she must be getting on towards 100 years old now, Gertrude Himmelfarb, I don't think you remember the name, married to Irving Kristol. And she said to me, they once had an apartment overlooking Central Park. Is that possible? And her mother came to stay with her. And there was a time in the 1980s when everyone, on a Sunday morning, Central Park was absolutely full of joggers. And her mother was looking out of the window at all these people jogging. And she turned to Gertrude Himmelfarb and said, "Who are they running away from?" So our enemies know how to manipulate these fears. So this is basically what happens. There's an annual gathering of university lecturers, professors. The Islamists will wait until the very last session of this conference, which is usually on a Friday afternoon. By this time, almost everyone has left, and all the Jews have left because it's way out of a Jewish district and they've got to get home for Shabbos. And then, let's say there are only 50 of the 2,000 who were at the big plenary sessions of the conference left, they will then propose an academic boycott of Israel. So it only takes 30 radicals to win a vote like that. The vote then goes back to the leadership of the Union of University Teachers, who will immediately throw it out. But for a few days, it is there as a vote on the record, even though it was never adopted by the union, and even though they know it won't be adopted. Because they know that that vote will be reported in the press. And they know Jews will not stop to ask exactly what happened. They'll say, there's an academic boycott. And that will then ricochet around the Jewish world, getting added intensity with every time. This is actually what happens. There was an occasion when I actually had to come out to America and do a lecture tour for the ADL because one email went out which said that British schools are not teaching the Holocaust because Muslims object. Now, within 6 months, every American Jew I knew had had this email on at least 6 times. The Holocaust Education Trust put out the correction within 24 hours that there was one school in the whole of England where the Holocaust studies were not taught for 1 year because no member of staff was qualified to teach. No American ever saw that correction. All they did was they saw the initial thing. I mean, as a matter of information, you might be interested to know that Gordon Brown and the British government provided already 10 years ago, and it's been maintained by David Cameron, it's the only government in the world that does so, it funds every single school, junior and senior in Britain. The government funds the school to send 2 pupils and 1 teacher to Auschwitz, so that come Holocaust Memorial Day on 27th of January, every school will have witnesses who visited Auschwitz and can speak from personal experience. So there is no country that takes Holocaust education more seriously, but that didn't stop this impression gaining ground. There was a radical Islamist called Ed Hussein, who was a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, who did tshuva and became a moderate and has since fought the radicals. And he published a book, and it might just be of interest to you. It was written maybe 8 or 9 years ago, but it's interesting. It's called The Islamist. And in it he tells the story of how around half a dozen Islamist radicals completely took over an English university with 20,000 students. Just 6 of them. by threatening to expose the university to the press as offenders against human rights, as Islamophobes, if they did anything to stop the radicals doing what they were doing. And what they were doing, for instance, was intimidating students into no mixed seating in public lectures, intimidating all the Muslim girl students to wear hijabs. They were actually taking over this. It was the scariest book I have ever read, because it showed just how easy it is for a determined group of extremists to manipulate a university or manipulate the media. So I'm telling you all this so that you should know that, number one, Britain is not an anti-Semitic country. Number two, there isn't an academic boycott. Number three, whenever there's a suggestion of an academic boycott, the government announces increased cooperative action between the Russell Group of the top 18 research universities in Britain and Israeli universities. And you should know that Elaine and I, knowing that campus could be difficult for Jewish kids, beginning in 2002, all the way through for 12 years, until I was no longer chief rabbi, each year we would invite to our home the entire leadership of the National Union of Students. Is there a National Union of Students in LA? You don't have that. But in Britain, all the students come together. I mean, they're all non-Jewish. All the officers of the NUS are not Jewish. So we would invite them in June after exams. And I would always ask the leadership of the NUS, who'd just been elected, what they would like a seminar on, and I'd give them an hour seminar. And then we'd invite a wider group of their leadership to a party in the garden, because there's at least a small chance that June in Britain, it's not going to rain. I mean, only a small chance. But now, no other group in Britain took the students seriously and gave them this kind of close relationship. The end result was that even at the times when the academics were being negative about Israel, the students were always supportive, not of Israel, but of Jewish students. They were supportive that no campus should be an environment in which Jewish students feel intimidated. So we went out to make friends, and we made friends. And that's basically how we did things in Britain. Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and I took 3 leaders of every single faith and subdivision of faith in Britain on a day trip to Auschwitz. And we sat for 2 hours after that trip in the airport in Krakow, and we really communed. It was an epiphany. They spoke their fears and we spoke ours. So you can defeat this. But what I most wanted you to realize is that not everything you read in the press is telling you that Britain is Germany in 1933.
Do we have anyone like to ask a question? And I ask, could you please also keep them to questions and not comments if possible? So, thank you.
Thanks so much for talking tonight. It's been really enlightening. My name's Nathan. I'm a fellow at the Engage program, which I'm also very grateful to have the chance to be here as part of that program. I wanted to ask to put creativity to the ultimate test about achieving Middle East peace. So you mentioned that that kind of the 3.0 version of anti-Semitism is how it's wrapped up in the nation-state of Israel, and many people believe that the only way to maintain a Jewish state, that we've reached a point, or we will soon reach a point where you have to choose between having a democratic state and having a Jewish state. Do you think that trade-off is a real one? And if so, how, from your standpoint, should Jews navigate that? Not necessarily from a geopolitical standpoint as Israel, but as a Jewish community more generally as it relates to that?
Well, as somebody who profoundly believes that whereas religion and science are compatible, I equally profoundly believe that religion and politics are incompatible. I think that when religion intervenes in politics, the results are uniformly disastrous. They're bad for politics and they're bad for religion. And when a political disagreement becomes religionized, it becomes insoluble. Because all peace depends on what is in politics a virtue, but in religion is a vice, namely compromise. So although I am actually a member of the upper chamber in Britain, I'm a member of the House of Lords. And I have been since November 2009. I have not voted once. And I do not sit as a party peer, I sit on the cross benches. Because I do not believe that I am entitled to a vote. I just believe I'm entitled to a voice. So I'm not going to give you an answer to that question. I think that's for the people of Israel to decide. And what we are seeing here is the unfolding in the Middle East, in Israel, of a Greek tragedy in a religion that does not understand Greek tragedy. I mean, I wonder if you ever thought we've had enough suffering in Jewish history. You would have thought somehow Hebrew has a word for tragedy. You know what the Hebrew word for tragedy is? Do we have an Israeli here? Somebody tell me. Tragedy. We had to borrow. Are you with me? So what is happening here is a tragedy of a kind that this just doesn't make sense to us. So therefore, I return to what I see as an absolute fundamental truth about the Middle East, which is that if there is any people in the entire world who can understand the suffering of Palestinians, it's Jews. And I hope if there's any people in the world who can understand the suffering of Jews, it's Palestinians. And therefore, in order to make peace, we have to clear away the debris and detritus of what I think is, a bad history of secular and rather corrupt politics on the one hand, and an Islamic theology that says any land that was once under Islamic rule must always be under Islamic rule. I think that itself is a very difficult theological concept. Of course, if I'm going to call that into question, I may have to call into question standard interpretations of the Torah as well. So my next book is going to be a critique of violence in the name of religion. It comes out in early June in Britain, in October here in America, and it's called Not in God's Name. And it's the strongest book I've ever written. It's a religious protest against religious violence. And one of the things I look at in the book is what I call the sibling rivalry between the three Abrahamic monotheisms. Because, yes, there is a connection between religion and violence. I don't deny it, I analyze it in the book. But it is particularly concentrated in the adversarial relations between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So, as you know me by now, we've known each other for at least an hour or two. You know that I don't just state problems, I try and state solutions. So, in the middle bit of the book, I go through all the sibling rivalry narratives in the Bible and give them a new reading. And then I make the comprehensive argument of what needs to happen in the Abrahamic theologies for them to be able to live with integrity in God's world. So it's going to be called Not in God's Name, and I hope there'll be a lengthier argument here. and I wish I had an easier answer, but I have sat with previous leading members of Hamas who are today peace activists, so I don't rule anything out. And if I wrote a book called Future Tense, in which I tried to define positively what it is to be Jewish without anti-Semitism. And I called Judaism, not likely, the voice of hope in the conversation of humankind. And I think it is incredibly important for us to keep amongst the Israelis and Palestinians that flame of hope alive. Because the politics of hope is a good politics. The politics of fear and despair is the worst kind. So I hope I've given us a little fragment of hope.
Hi. Your creative solutions seem to have one thing in common, if I'm remembering right, which is personal interaction.
Yeah.
With vast parts of the world having no Jews, Jews being 0.9% of the world population, I think. Less.
0.2. 1.9. 0.19.
0.19. Okay, I misheard. Well, I guess the question is obvious. How do you imagine implementing those creative solutions to make a difference at the global scale?
Well, I once said Jews need to make 3 friends in the 21st century, just 3. Number 1, India. Number 2, China. Because India and China are both civilizations as ancient as Judaism, and neither has had any history of anti-Semitism. In fact, they were so nice to Jews in China that they sort of disappeared. They all married out and became Chinese, So India and China, and then number 3 is the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church has really changed since Pope John the 23rd, since Nostra Aetate, and that has been a tshuva that has been carried further by the current Pope Francis than any pope in Christian history. I mean, this man has gone further than all of his predecessors. Now, there are 1.2 billion Catholics, there are 1.2 billion Indians, there's 1.1 billion Chinese, and there are a few of us, not many, but a few. Add all those together, and we just tip the balance. We've got half the people on the face of the earth. But don't think you can make friends without actually going out and making. It actually takes that effort, which is why I was in the Vatican back in November, why Elaine and I spent a week with the Hindus and Sikhs in Amritsar, which is the holy city of the Sikhs. And China, we haven't got there yet, but the Chinese like Jews, they really do. In fact, I used to be chief rabbi of Hong Kong, and when the Brits had to give it back in 1997, the Jewish community said, would I continue to visit them? So obviously, whenever I go to a country and there's a change of government, I as chief rabbi, would always meet the head of state. So after Chris Patton was the last governor, I went to meet Tung Chee-hwa, who was the first Beijing appointee in Hong Kong. And it turned out he loves Jews, and he loves Judaism, and he loves Israel. And he said to me, Chief Rabbi, your people and my people are very old. In fact, your people are older than my people because we've been around for 5,000 years, and your people have been around for 6,000 years. And what I want to know is, what did your people do for the first 1,000 years before they had kosher Chinese takeaway? And I said, Mr. Tung, you know what we did for the first 1,000 years? We complained. So there there you are. We go, met 3 friends, we're in business. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Rabbi Sachs, for coming to speak with us. I wanted to ask you if you could maybe elaborate on a point that you made during your talk earlier today. You seem to draw an analogy between that to believe in God requires a certain leap of faith, and to believe in the scientific method required a similar leap of faith. Could you maybe elaborate more on that point that you made?
Do you have the book? I mean, I've read. What? I think we have it. Aren't all those quotes in the book? You know, I wasn't relying on my you know, I kind of tend to write books. I don't read them. So I've forgotten where I said this. But the truth is there is a basic faith that lies behind science. And it seems to me that, sorry, sorry, it's a while, you know, actually written 3 books since then, so I kind of moved on to, I just forgot. But I quote all the famous scientists who say that to be a scientist involves faith. It does indeed. It seems to me there's some basic to the human person. That let's face it, we're not the only language using species. But that we are the only species capable of the future tense. We are the only species capable of imagining a world that has never been seen or experienced by any of our senses, but merely by thinking it. And once we've thought it, we're able to bring it about. We are the only species in the 3 million species of life on Earth, in all these hundreds of billions of galaxies with hundreds of billions of stars, capable of asking the question why. Now, we will always seek that point beyond the visible horizon. And that's what led the first human beings, you know, in their kayaks and canoes, to set sail for Australia, or to set sail for, you know, the Easter Island. There is this human curiosity which leads us beyond the visible and the provable. So, yes, David Hume's famous problem of induction, the fact that the sun has risen 1,000,000 times, does not prove it will rise the 1,001st time. So, in a loose sense, there is no scientific proof of scientific methodology. As I try to explain in the book, there is no proof for the basic framing assumptions of any discipline. And this faith is just a common feature in human intellectual exercise. So I never felt that in science you don't need faith, but in religion you do. On the contrary, I mean, to have been Beethoven, to have been Van Gogh, to undertake anything creative, you have to have faith. You know, my philosophy teacher, the late Bernard Williams, wrote a famous book called Moral Luck, which was about Gauguin. You know, Gauguin, who's a French stockbroker living in Paris, gives up his job, leaves his family, goes off to Tahiti. He does not know. What is the rational evidence on which he could base a decision like that? There's no way you know. It's justified if he's a genius. If he isn't, if he's third rate, it isn't justified. But he cannot know until he tries. So to do anything creative involves risk. And I think the most extraordinary fact about the Hebrew Bible is the fact that it tells us that God is not omnipotent and omniscient. In creating humanity, he took a risk. And as my Bubba would say, bin if disappointed. He took a risk. I'll make something in my own image. They'll be nice. They'll say thank you. Adam and Eve sinned. Cain and Abel committed their first human children, the first fratricide. By the time we're in Genesis 6, God is already regretting that he created man in the first place. That is not an omniscience by some other name. The fact is, the Bible is telling us that creation involves a risk, even for the creator of the universe. So I think that faith, to me, religion is not certainty. It's the courage to live with uncertainty. And that courage is involved in every great undertaking, religious, artistic, or scientific. And I hope you understand that I'm trying to show that this is not a unique suppression of the intellect as far as religion is concerned. In Judaism, we believe that that intellect that we have is God's greatest gift for us. When it says, "Na'aseh Adam b'talmeinu kidmutenu," let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, what does Rashi say? Lahavin ulahaskil, to understand and to discern. God gave us this intelligence. He did not ask us to sacrifice it. 3 times a day, 6 days a week, every weekday, we say in our prayers, in our Amida, what is the first thing we pray for? We ask God to give us critical intelligence. That is not the voice of a religion that asks us to sacrifice our rationality, our critical faculties, or our intellect. Our intellect is God's greatest gift to us. But to think you have to be able to prove everything before you undertake a risk, I've got to tell you, if you believe that, you'll never get married. Marriage is an act of faith. Anything worthwhile is an act of faith. So religion is just one among them.